Hello and welcome to Project Noon, a platform dedicated to critically and creatively exploring Hindu-Muslim dialogue. My guest today is Professor Muhammad Umar Faruque. Professor Faruque is Inayat Malik Assistant Professor and a Taft Center Fellow at the University of Cincinnati. He also holds a visiting scholar position at Harvard University. Well, today's discussion is focused on Professor Faruque's 2021 publication, Sculpting the Self, Islam, Selfhood, and Human Flourishing. The book addresses what it means to be human in a secular post-Enlightenment world by exploring notions of self and subjectivity in Islamic and non-Islamic philosophical and mystical thought. Alongside detailed analyses of major Islamic thinkers, this study also situates their writings on selfhood within the wider constellation of related discussions in late modern and contemporary thought. What's fascinating about the book is also that it draws insights from several disciplines, such as religious studies, philosophy, anthropology, critical theory, as well as neuroscience. And it argues against views that narrowly restrict the self to a set of cognitive functions and abilities, and instead proposes a multidimensional account of the self that offers new options for addressing central issues in the contemporary world, including spirituality, human flourishing, and meaning in life. I must also mention that Professor Faruque had previously delivered a talk for us in August 2023 when we had organized an online workshop in collaboration with the Cambridge Interfaith Program. So since then, I've been really meaning to engage Professor Faruque on this fascinating book, which is doubly fascinating for me because of my own background in neurophysiology, as well as my interest in philosophy of mind. Professor Faruque has a brilliant discussion on neurobiological theories of consciousness and their limitations, which is something to look forward to in the course of our conversation. But first, Professor, thank you for your generous time and for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for kindly inviting me to have this interview. It's a pleasure to be here, Dr. Ismail, and I'm very much looking forward to having a great discussion on some of these topics, especially our common mutual interest on neurophysiology and neurobiological theories of consciousness.
Right, thank you. At the outset, I suppose, can you tell us a little bit about what you term the problematic of the self? So is the self a modern invention, firstly? And if not, then what are the peculiarities of the modern self as opposed to the non-modern or the pre-modern self?
Sure. Let me begin with some general comments, which will answer this question. So first of all, when it comes to various scientific and philosophical topics, I think it's my humble opinion that understanding ourselves, in other words, the topic of selfhood, it's perhaps the most complicated scientific and philosophical inquiry today. And it's because of the following reasons. First of all, when it comes to a sense of the self, what I mean, when it comes to an everyday understanding of the self, like everybody has a sense of who they are, we think ourselves in terms of beliefs, feelings, emotions. That's very normal. But science, or many scientists, tell us that somehow we are just biological machines. If we are just biological machines, then this sense of self, as with emotions, beliefs, memories, imagination, simply doesn't make sense. And then on the one hand, we seem to have traditional understanding ourselves in terms of soul, in terms of spirit, in terms of moral psychology. But neuroscience and many neuroscientists tell us that somehow these are, especially the notion of soul and spirit, these are folkloric notions. They're not scientific. It's kind of, they don't make sense. These are just kind of people use in everyday conversation with no real scientific value. And then on top of all these, you have a postmodern understanding of the self, where we are told that when it comes to our identity, it's as fluid as you can imagine, because there is no essence to human nature. Human nature does not have an essence in terms of a soul, in terms of any definition, let's say rationality or reason, whatever. So all of these things, and so we have all of these debates about race, gender, and sexuality. So it's a very complicated situation, and it's also extremely personal, even if we reflect on these or not. But these are a lot of the kind of social and political debates we're having around the world have to do directly with an understanding of the self. So one has to understand why this is such an important topic, and why it's also extremely misleading to think that there can be an easy empirical solution or understanding to the notion of the self, which I discussed at the very beginning. People tend to, people normally tend to see science as some kind of religion today, like the authority of science. So before, many people used to think of scripture when it comes to important issues. Today, people simply think, oh, just by coding science or using that tag science, they can simply explain away self and consciousness. But as many philosophers argue, and I'm completely with them as far as this issue is concerned, understanding the self, understanding our consciousness, it's not simply a scientific issue, and this will be clarified in the course of this conversation as well, because the self is a subject, and anytime we have any scientific discussion, it already presupposes a sense of the self, it presupposes consciousness, intersubjectivity, and all of that. So now, added to all this is the idea of the modern self and modernity itself. As you can see how this is getting so complicated, but also so fascinating, because if we are patient enough, if we really want to explore this and want to get to the end of this puzzle, we'll be able to resolve many questions that bother us today, many so-called modern challenges. So there are philosophers, and I've written about this in a separate article as well, philosophers such as Charles Taylor, who argue that the self is somehow a modern invention. So first of all, before analyzing this claim, I just want to explain the distinction between modern and pre-modern or non-modern. I prefer the term non-modern because because modernity is deeply tied to the notion of colonialism, and so while colonialism kind of colonizes a space, which is obvious because it grabs the lens of other people, modernity also kind of colonizes time itself, because whenever you say pre-modern, even if you don't know whether what you're going to learn about can be very insightful, relevant to whatever you're discussing, you somehow seem to be thinking, oh, just because it's pre-modern, somehow its epistemic status must be lower than anything that's quote unquote modern. We use the word modern in that sense in everyday conversation. To call something modern is to already kind of give it a higher epistemic status vis-a-vis non-modern. And but pay attention, this is just an assumption. There is no scientific or philosophical argument, empirical evidence to kind of show that this is the case as far as whatever we're talking about. But yet, because of all sorts of discourses, all sorts of history in the last 500 years, I can't go into the details of these things. They, seminal events that took place in the West, nominalism, and then Protestant revolution, and the scientific, Copernican revolution, scientific revolution, and Enlightenment and secularization in the 19th century, and finally in the 20th century, all sorts of other issues. It makes it very difficult to think about. Of course, Eurocentrism is at the heart of all this. It makes it very difficult for us to kind of think about other cultures, or even when it comes to important issues of self, science, in a respectable manner in relation to the non-modern. And so that's the reason I prefer the non-modern world. Because from one point of view, the distinction between modern and pre-modern or non-modern is simply, it's colonial in a way. Because if you look at the writings of an Indian or Islamic philosopher, let's say in the 13th or 14th century, they also obviously were engaging with other philosophers who came before, let's say Plato or Aristotle, nearly 1500 years or 2000 years before, right? So in Arabic, they would use terms like mutaqaddim or mutaakhir, earlier one, mutaqaddimin or mutaakhirin, earlier ones or later ones. But just because it happens that some philosopher like Plato is from 5th century BC, and someone like Sohrawardi, a fellow Islamic philosopher from around like 200 years before, Mullā Ṣadrā, the philosopher who's writing in the 14th century would not automatically think, oh, just because Plato came 2,000 years before, his writings must be, less valuable, because with time there's progress, things get better. The teleological understanding of progress leading to ultimately the modern West or modern Europe and the Hegelian understanding. That was not at all the case. In fact, you'd see the opposite. But today we think, oh, after Descartes, after these big people, the famous people, supposedly like Galileo and Descartes, Newton, you kind of draw this distinction, modern and pre-modern. And then you tend to think that somehow before modern philosophy, before Descartes, somehow whatever they are saying, the pre-modern philosophers, they had limitation. They had historical situatedness. They didn't have modernity. They did not have science, whatever. And so whatever they must be saying about selfhood and consciousness must be seen as something historically situated. And you all automatically date. You'd see, academics putting date next to these historical names, like so-and-so is from 5th century, 6th century. But you don't tend to do that with respect to Descartes, Kant, Hume, philosophers from the modern period or early modern period. Let's modern period. Why? Because there's the assumption that somehow modernity happened. That's the modern period. So when you take this context and you look at a modern philosopher such as Charles Taylor, you have these claims that, oh, when it comes to something as important as the self, it's actually a modern idea, because things like inner depth, expressivity, imagination, self-determination, these are distinctly modern ideas associated with the self. And whereas in pre-modern cultures, there are kind of proto-understanding of the self, not really solid understanding of the self based on reflection or objectivity. Like you are thinking of yourself, you're objectivizing yourself, and you're coming up with different definitions. So I don't want to get into details, but there is this assumption still widely shared by a lot of sociologists and of course, perhaps most of the philosophers, that somehow it's only with Descartes, we had this idea of self-objectivation, and leading to different ideas of the self, because you begin to see yourself and you begin to define yourself in different ways. Whereas in pre-modern cultures, people just more or less thought about themselves in terms of various roles, various communal functions. They didn't have a distinct sense of the self. They didn't have a distinct sense of inwardness, individuality, and all of that. And so I show both in the book and also in another article, actually a few other, I've written many other articles on this topic, that this is just not true. In fact, not just me, Jonardon Ganeri also wrote a book called Inwardness, a very accessible book, where he shows how, so if you want to just zoom in on this idea of inwardness being a hallmark of modern self, you actually see this in everywhere. Indian philosophy, all of this. People are talking about inner dimension of the self, or of course in Sufism, in Islam, practically everywhere. So it's really surprising why people would have, but I already explained why people tend to have biases with the understanding, with the notions such as modernity or modern versus pre-modern and all that. So just as in modernity, in modern times, in modern Western context, you have many different understandings of the self, all the way from Descartes, Hume, Locke, Hume, and Nietzsche, to Daniel Dennett, Zahavi, Heidegger, whoever. So some people denying that there's anything like the self, others saying no, the self has to be there. There's a variety of different ways of looking at this. You have similar complexity when it comes to an understanding of the self in in non-modern cultures. And by the way, I will be very careful again on saying non-modern, because some of these traditions, like Islamic and Indian traditions, they're living traditions. When you say non-modern, sometimes it implies that they're just put in the museum, they're placed in the museum, and they only have historical worth. But that's obviously not the case. It's a living tradition. So you can see the ideas of Eurocentrism, Hegelianism is so deeply entrenched. Anytime you want to have a discussion around these topics, you have to overcome some of these basic obstacles.
Right. I think that really nicely sets the stage for our further discussion. But before we actually get to some of the philosophical discussion, while we can see that an idea of selfhood or inwardness existed in non-modern or pre-modern context as well. Uh, One question that we might ask is, what is different about the modern idea of the self compared to non-modern ideas? For example, Charles Taylor is saying that self is a modern invention. Is there something which is invented in or added in modern times to the idea of selfhood?
Right. So first of all, there are 2 points that need to be addressed here. So the first one is, so you have this idea of the modern self, and then again, which might be a generalization, because as I was saying, there's a spectrum. You can't say,
Right.
if you have someone like Nietzsche, if you have someone like Dennett, and many other philosophers who even deny that there is anything like the self, let alone this inwardness, inner dimension, inner depths, romantic notions, So, but these are also modern philosophers, right? No one had said Daniel Dennett, Nietzsche is not a modern philosopher, right?
Right.
So first of all, one has to be very careful about that kind of generalization. But even if you are, argue, because this idea is tied to the notions of progress, civilization, and all that. Because if you don't have a notion of the self, if only in modern times you have come to develop an understanding of the self in terms of subjectivity, inwardness, and reflexivity. This is some of the things Charles Taylor kind of as markers, he points out. Then it implies that pre-modern cultures were kind of passive. They were just like, they are not fully, like they don't have full self-consciousness, self-determination. And that's very, it doesn't feel good at all, right? Like you don't have even free will. You don't know who you are. So you have, in order to be really fully human, you have to achieve this, modern notion of the modern understanding. You have to achieve inwardness. You have to achieve reflexivity. In other words, you have to follow the West. You have to be, so this is very problematic, even though Charles Taylor himself probably was not thinking along the lines of colonization, but there are still traces in his writings about it, and others are very clear. Others are, the civilizing mission that we all heard about. But now let's take the idea of inwardness being the hallmark of what being a self. So Charles Taylor defines it, and he kind of connects this with the idea of reflexivity, which Descartes is famous for. Like, you are kind of thinking about yourself, and you are turning yourself upon yourself, and then you are coming up with the definition that the essence of selfhood is thinking. And then Locke and others take this idea further. Anyway, even if you take this to be the main feature of the modern self, and you think that this is not found in other cultures, that's not at all the case. So if I can direct you to my my article and articles, especially the article on Charles Taylor and the book, provide tons of evidence from Islamic philosophers such as Avicenna, Suhrawardi, and Mullā Ṣadrā and others, where I show how this idea of reflexivity, turning your gaze inward, taking yourself as an object, is fully there. But now here's the flip side of the argument. So that kind of refutes the idea that modern self is not so unique as people claim to be, because this idea of inwardness, inner depth, in terms of kind of very strong sense of reflexivity, taking yourself as an object, turning the self upon itself, is there in Islamic philosophy, and of course in Indian philosophy. But then this idea of inwardness, it's not actually very great, because now there are a lot of psychologists and some philosophers who are actually criticizing this idea of inwardness, because it leads to hypersubjectivity. You are only thinking about your mental world, and you are thinking about yourself as a hyper individual, like, cut off from everything else. And that seems to be one of the main causes of a lot of mental health issues like depression, anxiety. People are even talking about post-society. Sociologists are talking post-society. So, at first sight, it might seem like, oh, inwardness, your own mental world, this is also great, inner dimension, inner self. This is, giving rise to the idea of subjectivity, individuality, self-determination. Who doesn't want all of this? Yes, from one perspective, that's also, I personally think, there's nothing wrong with the idea of the individual. But if we suffer from what I call Cartesian, syndrome, like over objectivation or hypersubjectivity, at the expense thinking about the self in terms of only the individual, me, at the expense of relational and communal being, then it leads to all sorts of other issues that we're facing now. Burnout, feeling, and feeling lonely. This, you can look at all the statistics. In fact, I gave a few talks about these issues. That's number one. And secondly, it also leads to the idea that somehow we human beings are cut off from rest of the world, rest of the natural world, nature, which is one of the main sources of, as you know, climate crisis. And this whole idea of nature being separate, you can trace its genealogy back to Galileo and Descartes. So this idea of inwardness, although very much needed, very much part of our subjectivity, but taken to its extreme without an understanding of relational and communal being, or what I call the anthropocosmic understanding of the self. The self, the human being, is part of the cosmos. You can never separate the human being, from the rest of the natural world or universe. You can only do so artificially in your mind, but then that leads to all sorts of weird ideas, like philosophers are today saying, oh, there's nothing called reality. It's all matrix. It's all simulation. You can see where this leads to hypersubjectivity and also hyperobjectivity, actually. So yeah, I don't think there's anything too unique about the modern self in terms of inwardness, but in fact, sometimes pre-modern self, understanding notions of the self have an advantage, because while, let's say Sufi notions of the self, about they focus on the inner dimension. There is so much talk about the inner self or inner world or inner dimension of the self, but they do not just talk about the inner self. They also talk about the self in terms of its relationship with the cosmos. That's why you have microcosm, macrocosm analogy. Or going back to even the Quran, there's a verse that says, "Sanurihim ayatina," we shall show them our signs, fil wafa wal anfus, on the horizon and on yourselves. So there's an intimate connection. If you come from that kind of background, there's a deep interconnection, interrelatedness between the self and the cosmos and being itself and reality itself, ultimate reality.
Right. I think one peculiarity of the modern self which emerges, it seems, is that this disconnect which you're talking about between the microcosm and the macrocosm, or this hyper individualism, as it were. Stephen Colony, the historian, described the romantic self as a self detached from any tradition. So this sociological or institutional uprooting of many traditional institutions and cultures could give us a very peculiar idea of, or a very peculiar form of the self emerging in modernity, as opposed to, I suppose, in non-modern times.
Yeah, so you can make that argument, because as I said, when we say the modern self, it does not mean just one thing.
Right.
If it means just inwardness, self-determination, you can see that those ideas are present. But when you add those other ideas, like modernity, which are tied to a broad understanding of what modernity is itself, which is also complex. Sociologists, philosophers define modernity in many different ways. But there are some certain features that you can pinpoint, and which you just mentioned. For example, there's the idea of the individual. There's the idea of kind of tradition being not important at all. There's the idea of, like, you decide your values, what's good for you, regardless of, your surrounding past or family, etc. And also disregard for, traditional values like family in general. Again, I don't want to say it's
Right.
true all across in all Western countries or all understanding of the modern self, because then it will not be true. But by and large, you can see that kind of understanding being very prevalent.
Right.
Yes. So
Right.
when we accept those, then yeah, you can say that there's something peculiar about being a modern human, being a modern subject, being a modern self. But then notice these ideas are normative. Like whether you accept tradition being a source of value is up to you. It's not like, you have to do that. You have to choose. You have, there are incontrovertible scientific and philosophical evidence showing that, whatever is of value in the past or from whatever value you can derive from tradition is simply false. No one can show that. These are normative. Like
Right.
you think because of many reasons. That's why, that distinction that I draw in my humble theory between descriptive and normative is so important.
Right.
Because there are certain aspects of the self that you can describe through neurophysiology, or even through social constructionism. But other understandings of the self, which are inseparable, are normative. Even the idea of the individual, on some level, it is normative. It's something to be aspired to. It's a work in progress. It's not a kind of scientific fact.
Right. This is the second point which I was trying to come towards. You have a chart about the classifying the various dimensions of the self into descriptive as well as normative. So you say that the selfhood or the self is both received as well as achieved. So it is both given as well as constructed, both descriptive as well as normative.
Yes.
Right.
Do you want me to show this chart? It might be way better. Yeah, because it's really, really difficult to understand because there are so many concepts and
Right.
concepts within concepts. So I know that's why I started with something more general, because
Right.
in the book itself, I had to develop this model because when you look at the academic literature in different fields, philosophy, anthropology, religious studies, and scientific studies, neuroscience, and whatnot, you tend to see all kinds of views of the self, and sometimes you just feel like whether there's any people are talking past one another or not. And then you realize that actually when they're using the term self, people have different notions in mind. It's not like they're talking about the same thing. That's why there are sometimes blatant contradictions between different scholars or different philosophers. So in order to resolve that, and also in order to make a better sense of the self and provide a kind of global framework, I developed this model. So the self for me is a spectrum concept, which is complicated. I explained the book, but then the basic idea is that it's multidimensional. When you talk about the self, there are different dimensions. And so you have biophysiological dimensions, socio-cultural, cognitive-experiential, and ethical-spiritual. But then there's a further division. So you can see the descriptive level and the normative level. So the scientific conceptions of the self would fall on the descriptive level, and more philosophical or ethical and religious understandings of the self would fall on a normative level. Not just because they're normative does not mean they're just matters of belief, because it's phenomenological in a normative. So I explained the notion of normativity. Think about the notion of beauty. Think about being a good parent. These are normative notions. You have to. There's always an understanding of good or bad. Moral evaluations in relation to some of these ideas. Selfhood is one such concept. We lose that idea when we simply focus on purely descriptive ideas of the self. You're describing various functions of neurons and how that affect your conscious states. We tend to think, oh, it's just scientific, but it's not at all like that. Being a self is aspirational. You want to be an individual. You want to be spiritual. All of this is normative, but just because they're non-normative does not mean they're subjective or just theological or whatever. They're not. They're actually phenomenological. So this is very important.
Yeah, that was really helpful to have that in front of us. Now, what are the varieties of self-knowledge that we can acquire. You
Yeah.
talk about a reflective versus a non-reflective kind of self-knowledge. Can you talk about that?
Yes. That's the primary philosophical question that should come to mind. How do we know ourselves? And how do we know anything at all? And that's a question, a general question in epistemology, whether you are doing science or, medicine or social, whatever. So you see that any basic proposition is composed of three elements, subject, object, and the process that connects the two. Now, if we kind of pay attention, we realize that before we want to know the world, before we tend to have any judgment about anything, absolutely anything, it can be as basic as I know myself, or can be I'm seeing you now, anything. So any of these propositions presupposes a self-knowledge and understanding of the self. So I show that logically why that has to be the case. I just don't want to go into the absolute details. That would be too complicated. But in a basic way, you can explain this in the following. So if we did not have any self-knowledge, who is it that knows whenever we make any assertions about the world, any scientific claims, right? It presupposes a self. Now, there's a paradox that is involved. So this is explained on page 62 of the book in the following. So on the one hand, the self must be, so this paradox is about self-knowledge. So I formulated this in the following. On the one hand, the self must be known prior to everything else, as I just explained. Since anything known must presuppose a subject for which it is known. While on the other hand, for something to be known, it must be an object, which leads to the paradox that while everything is known through the self itself remains forever unknown, since the self or the subject can never be an object. So that's the crux of the issue. Because the self, according to the arguments that I propose, is always it has to be a subject. But anything other than the self is always an object. So whenever we want to know something, we know it as an object. But apply the same method to self, it leads to this paradox. You know the self as an object in your imagination. It's like seeing yourself in the mirror. When you see yourself in the mirror, you're seeing an image of yourself, but you know very well it's not yourself. It's not other than yourself. The same is the case when we are trying to objectivize ourselves, whether in our thinking or imagination, we have an image of we can have an image of ourselves, we can have an understanding of ourselves, but that understanding is already an objectivation. It's not the subject anymore. It's not the self itself anymore. So a lot of these ideas that come out through science or even most of philosophy about the self are actually, these are they're not about the subject itself per se. They're more about the objectivized image of the self. And this is a very subtle, point that becomes very important as we discuss consciousness and neuroscience and all of that, stuff. But I don't think it's, so that leads to the paradox. You can, you have to have self-knowledge in order to know anything, but you cannot know the self as an object because the self is always subject. How do you kind of resolve this? Mm-hmm. Then, it leads to different forms of self-knowledge, reflexive or reflective and non-reflective, and then also into subjective. So for example, what happens when we try to know the self, let's say, through introspection or through kind of philosophical reflection. So there is an argument on page 69 of the book, which is formulating the following. So let's say I'm trying to know myself. I'm attending to myself, and in the process, I'm performing an active introspection. But this already implies an objectivation of the self, which can be called the introspected self. Now, let this introspected self be theta, and the self doing the introspection be phi, another Greek letter. That's the real self. Now, in order to have self-knowledge, there must be a complete identity between theta and phi. Complete identity between the subject that is introspecting or thinking and the object, which is also the self that is being introspected. But how can you ascertain, how can you assert, how can you prove this identity? Should I try to ascertain it through a further introspection? If I do this, I will then have theta 1. So that was, theta 1 was introspective self. And then the challenge would be to affirm the identity between theta and phi. But then in order to affirm this identity, I will need to carry out yet a further active introspection and, ad infinitum. So the only way to avoid this infinite regret would be to assert that I'm already acquainted with myself in some a priori non-objectifying fashion, which is existentially identical with the very being of myself. In other words, I know myself immediately through my consciousness, which is the very reality of the self. And I then go on to produce many different forms of arguments about what I call non-reflective knowledge from different traditions, Indian philosophy, Christian philosophy, Augustine, for example, and Islamic philosophers, and also some modern philosophers like Heidegger, Husserl. When they talk about self-knowledge in terms of being, there's this idea of pre-reflective consciousness. So you cannot have the most basic self-knowledge, which is needed for any type of scientific or philosophical discussion, through reflection or introspection, because of the arguments I just showed. You can find this in different forms, in different philosophies, as I said. So if you can't do that through introspection, reflection, in order to solve the paradox, you have to have some other understanding of self-knowledge, which I call non-reflective. So, and I give various examples. Think about the fact that I'm looking at this screen right now. And imagine, forgive me, imagine instead of looking at you, I'm looking at, maybe I'm watching a Harry Potter film, which I like very much. But, and I'm now deeply into the film, and I'm watching the film, and there is a particular scene which is so captivating. I just forgot everything else about the rest of the world, including myself. I'm fully absorbed into the film and the screen. So there will be some moments, those absorbed moments, when I'll not have self-consciousness, self-awareness, the fact that I'm kind of consciously and actively looking at the screen because I'm so deeply focused. It happens whenever you are deeply concentrated, focused on reading, on doing something any such activity. But there'll be then a lapse, and then you'll come back to yourself, or you'll say, oh my God, I was so deeply focused. I was not even aware that I was aware. I was not even aware that I was watching a film. But actually, I was aware because there was background consciousness, because I can clearly remember, in fact, I can remember very clearly what I was watching in those few moments when I had consciousness, but not self-consciousness, not reflective consciousness. So that clearly shows, alongside many other phenomena, such as when in deep sleep, what happens in deep sleep or in a state of coma, there is consciousness, but there is no self-consciousness. So, but that does not mean that that mode of consciousness is devoid of knowledge. It is actually, it contains epistemic value because it provides you with this data. So I actually argue the non-reflective knowledge, non-reflective self-knowledge is more important, more foundational than the everyday reflective knowledge of ourselves, which everybody knows. Right? We can always think about ourselves. We can always have a reflective understanding of the self, right? So, that's the difference between reflective and non-reflective.
Right.
Self-knowledge.
No, yeah, fascinating. Well, of course, you also say that science or neuroscience actually objectifies the self twice. How is that happening? Right.
Yeah. So in neuroscience, before we get to neuroscience, as I kind of discuss in the book, there are various theories. There's the theory that says I'm just my brain. The identity theory,
Right.
Steven Pinker, others, and then there's the neural NCC, neural correlates of consciousness. Every mental state has its neural correlates. That seems to be less problematic, but it's still, there are philosophers who are actually very critical of that idea, because a lot of people tend to think just because there is correlation between the brain and your mind, the brain must be the cause of your mental states, and ultimately consciousness itself must be a product of the brain. But there are many other views, and one view that is more substantial than any of the other neurobiological theories is what I call neural emergent. I think it's the neural emergence.
Emergentism, I think so, right?
Emergentism, neural emergence, something like that.
Right, yeah.
So, and then I get into details. So many of these theories, Edelman and Creek and others.
Right.
And I admit that you can, when it comes to different brain states, you can think about them in layers. So Damasio, Antonio Damasio, famous neuroscientist, he has this idea of proto-self, and then something like the conscious self, and then autobiographical self, and the corresponding conscious states. So he thinks when it comes to a full-fledged notion of the self as a self-aware being, which is the autobiographical self, it does not come into being just like that. There are steps, and the brain is the fundamental driver. So there is the kind of proto-self at the beginning. Just think about your basic neurobiological functions, or your basic, behavior that are connected to various motor functions in the brain. And then that itself leads to a bit more sophisticated understanding of the self, and then finally the autobiographical self. But then it's not at all clear how you make that jump from being a proto-self, just like a biological organism, to being a full-fledged human being with self-consciousness. But it assumes somehow there must be some processes in the brain that cause, consciousness. So, but this is an assumption which, I attack, and I also challenge, because, you have to have evidence if you claim that the brain or neurons, neurochemical activities cause consciousness. So because that itself presupposes some kind of dualism, going back to Descartes. Consciousness is this kind of quality, and there is this kind of body. In other words, there is mind separate, and there is kind of matter, and then somehow matter causing consciousness or mind. But it's actually the other way around. Consciousness is, if we are following the discussion so far, I've been actually arguing that consciousness is most fundamental, because you have to have even any discussions about how the brain how does the brain cause the mind. You have to have self-knowledge, and you can't have that through reflective self-knowledge. So, but science and philosophy, they are very much a reflective process, right? We objectivate, we take things as objective scientific inquiry. We take the body, we study the body as an object, right? Now I'm saying, when it comes to the self, if you know the self as an object, there's a problem, just like seeing yourself in the mirror. Because the self, there's a paradox. The self is always the subject. No matter how you try to catch the self as an object of scientific inquiry, you'll never be able to catch it. Because every time you're thinking, the self is already presupposed. Your consciousness and consciousness of everybody else in the room, all the other scientists and philosophers, is already presupposed. There's no way you can step outside of your subjectivity. But we do this in science all the time. Here comes the distinction between first person and third person. But briefly, I don't want to get into details. In science, we have this principle of objectivism. We take everything as an object, and we perform experiments. Let's say we want to study the body or the tree, the leaf of a tree, anything. We take it as an object, and then we detach it from our subject. In fact, we try to separate the subject and object as far as possible, so that there's no kind of subjective mingling, as with the object of inquiry. Now that works fine on some level, and we come to this amazing understanding of the body and everything else. But apply the same method to the self, it fails, twice. First of all, this is objectivation, because even before we do science, if we try to have an understanding of the self through our imagination or thinking, we are objectivizing the self. We are not really having a first-hand, direct, unmediated understanding of the self through our thinking and imagination. Now you apply scientific measurement processes, gadgets, and logical thinking. That itself adds another layer of objectivity to yourself. So yourself is hidden even deeper. So that's why when we come to this neurobiological understanding, the notions of the self, we're objectivizing the self twice, and we're kind of kept coming up with all sorts of hypotheses and questions like how does the brain know the mind? I mean, that question itself is so problematic to begin with, because it should be the other way around. At this particular moment, at this very moment, the thing with which I'm most intimately aware of, have direct knowledge of, is myself. But I'm not just myself, I'm an embodied person. I have my body, brain, and everything, right? Even though I do have some knowledge of neurophysiology and other parts of the body, different systems, this mechanistic idea, or anyway, the general idea of the body, I'm not really aware exactly at this moment what is exactly going on in the brain in terms of synapses and other neurochemical activities. I may come to know an understanding of the brain through some kind of MRI, fMRI, or maybe some in future autocerebroscope or something like that, directly. But then it's still, that would not be comparable to the knowledge that I have with myself. Like exactly now I know what it means to be a self, myself exactly, in a particular self, Muhammad, and what it means to be Muhammad in terms of my own thinking, imagination, whatsoever. You don't know that. You can kind of have it in there. So you can see, the self is something, the subject, because it's our very being. It's something we are most intimate with. Anything else, even the notion of the brain, body, these are concepts at the end of the day. Matter, they're all contained within our consciousness to begin with. So which one is more fundamental, consciousness or matter? Clearly, it has to be matter. But it's not just in terms of phenomenology and epistemology. Even in the order of reality, consciousness, this is more debatable, because those who uphold a materialistic or naturalistic understanding of the cosmos, they would say it's matter. But then, in the book, I didn't go through those ontological arguments, but in my future writings, I have a forthcoming volume monograph on climate change where I discuss these things. I argue that consciousness is fundamental, not just with respect to the self, but also with respect to the natural world, with respect to the world. And this is something you find in Buddhism as well. And amazing enough, even in modern science, in modern philosophy, people are now talking about panpsychism. There are a lot of scientists who are actually arguing that no, consciousness must be everywhere, even though they're not thinking of anything like the ultimate reality. But they're forced to admit that consciousness must be unlike the Cartesian, dualism picture that we are taught. So yeah.
Right. So when you're talking about the neural correlates of consciousness, this reminds me of something that Raymond Tallis says. Because as I mentioned previously, I had a conversation with him as well. So these discussions about the neural correlates, what neuroscience shows us that the brain and the various structures of the brain are necessary for consciousness, but they're not sufficient conditions for consciousness.
No, I agree with that. I actually cite Tallis because I find him very insightful about some of the theories of consciousness. Although I have some disagreements at the end of the day with his perspective, but because he's a humanist and he thinks that if we reduce the self to simply a neurobiological state, which is what Damasio and many others neuroscientists seem to claim, then you lose, the world becomes devoid of, life becomes in a way devoid of meaning, value, sense of beauty and all of that. You ultimately you have to artificially reconstruct all of this, and it really doesn't work. It leads to actually nihilism. So this is a very important topic.
Right.
As I said at the very beginning, why understanding the self is the most important philosophical and scientific topic today. Because ultimately, science, religion, everything is supposed to be about the human being and what makes life meaningful. But if you have a notion of the self like I'm a biological, like it's a biological machine, then the vast world of music, especially I'm deeply into Indian music, and anybody who has delved into that world, aesthetics and music, that the world is way more complicated than just logic and mathematics and geometry or modern science, which are important ingredients of reality, important to understand, to make up the sense of the nature of reality. But they're not just the only things. And also, yeah, neural correlates or the neurochemical activities underpinning our mind, our consciousness. I agree that because we're embodied beings, you cannot think about conscious activities or consciousness itself without some physical basis. So you have to actually go. So these questions of dualism or mind and the brain, which one is causing the two, which one, it only arises in a post-Cartesian context. It's so important to understand the foundation, the genealogy. But if you go back to Aristotle, the hylomorphism, you don't encounter this dualism of mind and body, mind and consciousness, mind and matter. But that does not prevent you from asserting the individuality of your consciousness, all of that. But you understand yourself as an embodied being, which means that your consciousness cannot be, or your various mental states cannot be ultimately separated from the rest of your physiology. There's a deep connection. You cannot say this, this is the very point where there's a separation between mind and matter. So there will always be some correlation, but it's not just with the brain. The brain is connected with other systems in the body, within the body. So consciousness is connected to other parts of the body, other parts, other organs as well. It's not, the brain seems to be the most important organ when it comes to our intelligence, conscious activity, but it's not the only organ, right?
Right.
So the brain is part of yourself, because your selfhood already implies this embodied state. But the brain itself, all of these examples, all of these evidence, arguments show that cannot be completely identified with consciousness. And I would say that, there are states, states of coma, other, subliminal states or other heightened states of consciousness where, your consciousness is, not only does it contain your body, but it's much bigger than, much more encompassing than just your body and the brain. And it's not fully, you cannot map every single aspect of your consciousness onto the brain as well. When it comes to everyday activities, it's easier. But what I'm having in mind are heightened, higher states of consciousness. So let's say in a state of deep contemplation, in a state of deep mystical contemplation. There are those states where you can't simply have one-to-one correlation with the brain, or you can't simply explain the consciousness just by explaining, whatever correlates you can find in the brain. And by the way, the brain, it's not just one-to-one correlation. It's, as we know, like hundreds of millions of connections, synapses. And, for a while, the scientists thought, oh, there must be a self spot. There must be a spot for everything, single mental activity. But it so happens that it's actually all intertwined. It's not the neurochemical activities in the brain. So anyway, these things arise, this kind of questioning itself arises because you are thinking that there must be a dualism of the brain and the mind, which, as I said, it's false to begin with.
Right. And as you mentioned, although we are privileging the brain in one sense in this discussion, the brain is not the only organ, and of course the neuron is also not the only cell which is involved in this. In fact, you also cite physicists like Roger Penrose, who
Yes.
try to situate consciousness at the level of the microtubule, for example. And well, so I think this is a good point to come to the discussion of what what are known as subtle bodies or lataif in the thought of someone like Shāh Walī Allāh, especially when we see certain limitations of the electrical model of the nerve impulse, which, as you mentioned, neglects the non-electrical manifestations such as mechanical, thermal, optical. So there are. So I mean, what does this idea of the subtle body contribute to our understanding?
Yes. So this is a very important point, because right now, so this is a point that pertains to the history of science, and we have to understand how scientific modeling itself works, and especially with respect to the brain, going back to the earlier phases of, research, 19th century, discovery of some of these, gadgets, transistors, and others. I think we begin to have more mechanisms. Well, it's not just with respect to brain, with respect to everything else. We tend to understand them in terms of system. That word itself implies that it's some kind of machinery. The brain itself is a machinery. The body, it's an amazing machine. Everybody uses those terms as if, people from eternity have understood the body along those lines. No, it's only in the post-Cartesian phase. Descartes thought the animals were just mindless and soulless machines. Can you imagine, thinking of animals, if you have a pet especially, and you're thinking, they're just machines. And so you can do whatever with them because they don't have consciousness and feeling and so forth. So this is a problem with the mechanistic way of modeling things, and also using quantifying, models, which allows us to kind of map certain things, measure certain things very accurately, and it can be extremely helpful when it comes to, and you'd know this better than me, in medicine, like, for example, the measurements that we have with respect to heartbeat and all of that, pacemaker and all of that. Those things can be very helpful, like how these things work, and what are different things involved, and how you can use mathematical models to kind of model some of these things. But that also at the same time leaves out so much. And as I pointed out, recent studies have pointed that out. But now if we kind of zoom out and look at these things from a completely different point of view, which does not deny, by the way, the physical dimension of the body, but it's a different view. It's a view where there's no Cartesian ghost, there's no dualism of mind and matter, there's no kind of mechanistic view. So you tend to you have an understanding of the self in terms of the body, soul, and spirit, or body, mind, heart, and spirit, holistic understanding. And then that holistic understanding is also intimately tied to the natural world, the universe, the cosmos. So it is in that context you have to make sense of notions like lataif, prana, or chi. So this is fascinating. It's not just in Sufism. It's actually in many of these non-modern, non-Western philosophies. Well, even in Western philosophy, it used to be the case. So lataif, the term can be translated in many different ways. It's a plural from latif, meaning subtle energy, subtle points. So I translated this as subtle consciousness, and I provided the reason. Anyway, what is a latif, or what are lataif? Lataif are subtle animating energy, encompassing both the physical dimension as well as the psychological, spiritual dimension of our body, and also encompassing the cosmos itself. So it's very easy to understand if you think about, if you are fond of Kung Fu and martial arts, people always talk about chi and power and energy. And in the Indian tradition, we talk about prana. So the prana, again, it's not simply the breath in a scientific sense. It's much more than the breath and the air. And so there's no reason to be skeptical just because it sounds kind of non-scientific. Because while I personally am far from being against science, and I make it very clear, what I'm against is the scientism, or the kind of very materialistic, philosophically, driven understanding, materialistic understanding of the science, and reductionist understanding of science, but not the kind of throwing the baby out with the bath water, saying, no, we don't need science at all. I mean, science can be very helpful provided that it's integrated into a holistic metaphysics or holistic philosophy. So prana and chi, there are ways to make sense of them very intelligibly. Think about the states, your mental state as well as your appearances. There are moments when we feel like there's no life, in your face. And suddenly you remember something, or suddenly something happens, someone just, did something to you, and suddenly your face is radiating. So, you can't simply explain some of these phenomenological behavior appearances through, neurochemical activities in the body or the brain. It involves much more than just those kind of quantifiable determining factors. So lataif are those subtle points, subtle energy centers. So just like in in some forms of Indian philosophy and yoga, you have chakras, and they're laden with energy, right? Energy center, prana. Lataif are also exactly like that. These are situated at different points within the body, but because this is not Cartesian dualism, the bodily, there seems to be a correspondence between those subtle points within the body with the macrocosm. And I have some diagrams to kind of show that. That's how Sufis understand this. And it's about activating your lataif through meditative and various Sufi spiritual practices. That's how their significance, that's where their significance come from. It's not a matter of kind of belief. People can actually activate, just like a good yogi is able to control his or her breath and do amazing things. You have something, in fact, Sufism and yoga has a fascinating history and something to be contemplated in light of the present Hindu-Muslim situation, as you know, in India. It's just fascinating. And there's one Sufi, namely, whose name was Muhammad Iqbal from 15th or 16th century. I think he was a Naqshbandi. He said it's incumbent upon a Sufi to learn the science of yoga if he or she wants to be a good Sufi. Can you imagine? He didn't say every Muslim. He said, if you want to be a good Sufi, you have to learn the science of yoga. Why did he say that? It's like a Muslim philosopher saying that if you want to do good philosophy, you have to learn some Plato and Aristotle because they have important things to say. And there's a lot of overlap. It's not like Sufis had accepted everything the yogis would say, but they found that this is a spiritual, it's a spiritual journey through the self, and it involves all of these subtle animating forces within the body, and there's much valuable, there's much to learn from yoga about these things. But that does not mean that Sufism, lataif, and all of this kind of talk of animating energy points, they came from yoga. They did not. It pre-existed Muslim engagement with yoga in India. But anyway, that's the idea of the lataif, and it's a kind of, it allows you to reach God through a psychophysical medium. So through knowing the deeper aspects of your body, because there are these correspondences between your lataif, the subtle animating centers within the body, and the lataif in the macrocosm, ultimately leading to the divine self. By journeying through this lataif, you are able to penetrate the deepest being of yourself, which coincides with divine energy that is immanent in the world. So it's not a matter of just spiritual experience, actually very serious. It's about ultimately the ultimate goal of Sufism, like, losing yourself in the ocean of the divine, fana and baqa and those concepts, annihilation and subsistence in the ocean of the divine, in the ocean of divinity. So lataif, among many other ways, allows you to embark on that kind of journey through yourself. And it became very important in certain Central Asia and certain region in India, in certain periods in Sufism.
Well, of course, this brings us to the normative aspect of the self that we are talking about. Spirituality, which is again not an unproblematic term, as you point out, and also the idea of philosophy as a way of life. going back to Pierre Hadot's famous expression, versus what we can term professional philosophy, or the professors of philosophy, or that Nietzsche would write about. Before that, one really fascinating part of the aspect of the book is that throughout we have this idea of looking at the self as a multidimensional or as a spectrum concept. So we can't look at the self in isolation through any one of these dimensions. For example, if you're just limited to the neurophysiological dimension, in exclusion to the normative discussion, or vice versa. It's always really helpful to have all these different dimensions contribute to your understanding of selfhood as it emerges. So I mean, I suppose, I mean, coming to our final point for today, I suppose, the normative dimension of the self. Or can we talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So yeah, as I said, when it comes to the humble theory that I myself have proposed, it has two distinct levels. The self being having a descriptive level and also a normative level. And the descriptive, you have the scientific and phenomenological understanding, and also socio-cultural understandings of the self. And then you have the normative level, ethical, spiritual, and aspirational. This is because when you're thinking of the self, as you mentioned, and as I mentioned in the book, it's not just a matter of what is given, so which we can analyze through reflection, philosophy, science, but also what it means to be a self. It's not a matter of just receiving. It's also a matter of achieving. Selfhood is also both a given and also it's a matter of achievement. We always talk about what it means to be self, not just the scientific question of what is the self. They're inseparable. In fact, one of the problems with the purely analytic or scientific approaches to that is that you kind of artificially separate the two. We're moral beings. There's no way you can avoid certain evaluation with respect to the world, with respect to yourself, good and bad, high and low, all of this. That's because human nature is intrinsically grounded in a world which is moral and spiritual. I would say spiritual as well. And philosophers have kind of pointed it out through various arguments. So when you're talking about the self, it's like we're thinking about the analogy would be that of a seed. So when it comes to a seed, it can flourish provided that you cultivate it, and there's a good in the external environment and everything is good. It will ultimately flourish as a tree, give birth to fruits and so forth. But at the same time, if the external environment, if also other factors are not conducive, you don't cultivate the seed, then its life will be wasted in a way. The same can be said of the self. Selfhood is needs it's a kind of work in progress. It requires self-cultivation. It requires that's why I said I use the expression sculpting the self. Deriving my inspiration from the Greek philosopher born in Egypt, by the way, Plotinus. He has a famous passage in the Enneads. So the self is a matter of sculpting. It's like an unfinished product, unfinished statue that you have to sculpt, and that requires philosophy, reflection, what is good for it, what is bad. And so I point out how when it comes to human flourishing, what is good for the self, what brings happiness and peace and equilibrium, harmony, and all that everybody seems to desire, is an idea of self-transformation, which requires certain meditative and spiritual practices and philosophy. Now, philosophy itself has become a bad word because of the last few centuries, and Nietzsche is a very good starting point. He blames Kant, and I agree with him about this, although I have other issues with Nietzsche, his Übermensch and all that, also with Muhammad Iqbal, who was a Nietzschean in many ways. Anyway, but so philosophy used to be understood as a way of life. There's always part and parcel of your practical philosophy, flourishing, and spirituality. Spirituality also can be understood in many. I don't mean in a new age, in a way you understand, but in a more rational way, let's say. So when you have all of those things in place, it's a question of transforming, your current existential situation through spiritual practices such as practice of meditation and contemplation. And I talk about some of these in the book. How some of these spiritual practices kind of transform the self and lead to a point where you can think about flourishing. But the last point that I should like to mention with regard to the normative understanding of the self is that ultimately, because it's a normative concept as well, the self escapes here. It's very paradoxical, and the Sufi traditions, Islamic tradition, some trans-Sudan Islamic traditions actually seem to agree with the postmodern idea, at least from certain point of view, that human nature, when it comes to its definition, is indefinable. There's no kind of fixed definition of human nature. That's because the self is a locus of all sorts of possibilities. It's because ultimately the self is made in the image of the infinite. And that's why you can see all sorts of possibilities in human life. Some flourish, as great, musicians, scientists, philosophers, great moral exemplars such as prophet. But there are also examples where, some people, you'd not even call them human beings. They're so animalistic, they're so beastly in their behavior. They, do, terrible things. So it's very important to understand the metaphysical basis of that. And that's because there's no fixed definition. It's a matter of possibility. But that possibility depends on your self-determination, free will on some level, and self-understanding. Like, which path, what it means to have a good life, what it means to have a flourishing life. How can one have self-flourishing? So I argue in the book, and also in many of my articles and forthcoming articles, the published and forthcoming, that ultimately this idea of self as an anthropocosmic being leads you to develop a cosmic sensitivity, cosmic consciousness, not literally understanding every single detail of the cosmos, but having this holistic understanding that transcends kind of narrow, selfish, self-centered desires, nepotism, and then nationalistic feelings, only identifying with your tribe or with your nation, which you can do this, as long as you maintain those layers. As a human being, there's a profound connection between our deepest self and the self or the consciousness of the cosmos and the consciousness of the source of the cosmos. But that does not negate our individuality. That's why it's a spectrum. It's a journey of self-discovery, self-exploration. And so inwardness, inner depth it's very much a part of that. But at the same time, that should not lead to a kind of hyper subjectivity or hyper individualism. It should lead to, especially in the age of climate crisis, a more holistic understanding of the self, embracing the interconnectedness between the self and the cosmos and the source of the cosmos, the pure consciousness.
Right. Well, I think that's a good place to end at for today. I'd just like to mention that we touched upon a few key themes from your book, but there's a lot that we've left out, especially the details of your philosophical arguments, as well as your engagement with certain key Muslim thinkers such as Mullā Ṣadrā, Shāh Walī Allāh, Muhammad Iqbal. For all that, I'd suggest listeners to explore these aspects further in your book. So again, right, Sculpting the Self, Islam, Selfhood, and Human Flourishing. Thank you again, Professor Faruque, for your time.